Hello and welcome. I am Brett Bennis and I am here with Tom Bivona. Tom, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Brett. Good to be here.
Where are you now?
Currently in Bradenton, Florida for the purposes of my pre-doctoral internship.
Nice. So normally this is where I would ask my guest to tell us about himself and tell us a little bit about what he does. But I actually want to take this opportunity to introduce Tom for the next couple minutes because Tom and I actually worked together, trained together in the military, and spent countless hours of deep conversation in the barracks and had an amazing time with that. And here's a couple of the things that I've learned about you. You are an incredibly impressive person. You are incredibly disciplined. You are a warrior, intellect, soldier, linguist, scholar, professor, as well as being a lifelong healer. You have one of the most impressive resumes I have ever encountered when it comes to self-discipline and service of others. And here's just a few of the things that I wrote down just from memory. And I might get a few of the facts wrong here or there, but this is what I remember about you as a person. So bear with me, I put down some notes. Prior to serving in the military, you volunteered for a while as a suicide hotline agent to help people struggling against suicide. You chose to enlist in the military even though you had a promising career because you felt it was right to serve. Even though you already had a master's degree in psychology, if I remember correctly, you could have been an officer, you signed up as an enlisted person specifically because you wanted to know what your soldiers were going through before you signed up to lead them. I remember that conversation.
Correct.
While going through one of the most difficult language schools in the world, for one of the most difficult languages in the world, and I'm talking anywhere from 12 to 15-hour school days, you volunteered your extra time as a chaplain's assistant, sexual assault response coordinator's assistant, and I know there was one other, though I can't remember what it was. You attended religious studies even though you weren't religious, just because you wanted to understand. You volunteered at many airman wellness events, and I'm probably missing so many other things that you did while you were there. You are one of the fittest, most disciplined people I know. You're a martial artist in multiple arts. You run marathons, swim, bike, and I don't even know how many other sports. You are definitely one of the oldest in our school, yet you usually had some of the highest fitness scores, and you absolutely always outpaced me. And you usually were helping someone else train to improve their own scores on the side. You've served in multiple jobs in the military, and you voluntarily transferred from a successful career in one of the most intellectually challenging jobs that you can have in the military into one of the more physical challenging jobs in the military, kind of just for the challenge of it and to improve yourself. You refused to commission as an officer until you could go on deployment, again, so that you would know what your soldiers were going through before you sent them into it. Then after, as I understand it, multiple deployments, you finally decided you had enough experience to lead your soldiers, and you relented to become an officer in the military. And then you went into, I think you first went into security forces units and was an officer there, and then you transferred over back into the intelligence officer field, again back into the highly intellectual field, highly challenging. While you're in the reserves, or Guard? I'm trying to remember.
Guard.
You've been in both. Okay, so while you're in the Guard, you went back to school for your doctorate, and while you were doing that, you've taught as an adjunct professor of psychology, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And now you are getting ready, as just a couple months away from completing you already completed your doctoral thesis, as I understand, and just a couple months away from achieving your doctorate. Honestly, I'm probably not even covering half of what you've done because we haven't spoken all that much in the last couple of years, but you are an incredibly impressive person in your self-discipline and your dedication to help other people with your life. I'm honestly trying to figure out if there's any area of your life that you haven't developed with passion and determination. I want to know what drove you to develop this kind of life, and specifically, how have these things shaped your journey into becoming a lifelong healer as you have become?
Well, I will gladly answer that question, Brett. But first, I want to set the record straight on a couple of things. First, you use the word soldier. Just for the sake of accuracy, I am an airman. I passed the ASVAB. Never been in the Army. Secondly, I cannot take credit for being a chaplain assistant. I was one of the teal ropes, which for those of you who are not familiar with Air Force Tech School lingo, those are the enlisted students who act as points of contact in the unfortunate extremely unfortunate event that any sort of sexual assault or harassment takes place. We serve as a point of contact for survivors or served. I'm no longer in that role in the training, but act as a point of contact for survivors to get services and or seek justice through investigation. And finally,
didn't you serve as a chaplain's assistant like in holdover before you went? I seem to remember that before you went into tech school, you served as one.
I did a couple of things in holdover. It's been so long now. It's hard to believe it's almost been a decade.
Yeah.
I did greeting and direction for the med clinic, and I think I know what you're talking about. There was something, I think, with the refuge that I was looking to do. If you remember that old place at Lackland Air Force Base, I don't know if that ever manifested before we went to DLI, but it was something I was looking into.
I remember we were joking. We had a frequent joke about you needing to do one other rope so that you could become a rainbow rope and have all three. So.
Yeah, I considered doing. I've always had a lot of respect for the chaplain corps, because and you coming from the intelligence field, you understand this better than most. It's changing. I actually just redid my SF-86 to have my top secret reactivated. And nowadays, what you have to report as far as mental health is different. I don't think it's necessarily less stringent, but it's more you only have to report things that could reasonably be expected to impact your reliability, rather than, oh crap, you have a mental health history of any kind, you were depressed for like 2 weeks, you got to report that. But with that in mind, and the standards that mental health intelligence professionals have to maintain, and other elite members of the United States military, special operations, air crew, things like that, I always appreciate the fact that the chaplain corps has complete confidentiality, which even psychologists in the military and social workers do not possess. So I've always been a big supporter of the chaplain corps, even if I'm not a member myself. So that may be what you're referring to. And I did try, as I said, I want to say I was trying to get involved with the refuge in Lackland at some point. I know I spent some time there, but it's been a decade. I can't remember if I was an official member or not.
Like I said, I probably got some of the details wrong. I just remember you serving in practically every capacity that you could in order to help other people. And I remember just a lot of conversations surrounding that dedication and your history in that. So let's dig into it. What drove you to start volunteering in the ways that you did, to start serving in the ways that you did, on top of an already busy schedule, on top of everything that you did? What started that?
Well, I think it kind of started in graduate school. I went to a college that had a Christian basis. I wouldn't say it's it's called St. John's. So, there is a Christian / Catholic heritage, obviously. But part of the requirements of that school were that you had to do some sort of volunteer work in your first year. And I thought to myself, I could volunteer to pick up trash on the side of the highway, but if you've learned one thing about me, Brett, in your time knowing me, it's that I like to be efficient in the things I do and effective. So I was like, okay, if I'm here to learn how to help people in terms of mental health, I want to volunteer in a way that's going to get me some valuable experience. And one of the things we talked about in my first year intervention class was crisis hotlines and crisis resources. So I went up to my professor and I was like, hey, I got to do the volunteer requirement. Do these hotlines have volunteers? And she was like, yes. And I was like, cool, let me get set up with that. I signed a 6-month contract with them, and I ended up staying for nearly 4 years. The only reason I left was to go to basic. And in fact, when I went home on leave for the first time while we were in DLI, I picked up a shift just for old time's sake. I really enjoyed it.
Somehow I'm not surprised.
I really enjoyed it. I got a lot of satisfaction of being, that person manning the phone. And by the way, for any vets watching this, this is a call center for the Veterans Crisis Hotline and for the new 988 number. It used to be 800-273-TALK. But I got a lot of satisfaction of being there for people when they had nobody else. We had people who were literally on the precipice of making an attempt on their life or to take their own lives. And we had people who were completely safe and not in what most people consider a crisis, but just wanted to talk about how they regretted their career decisions and didn't feel like they could talk to their family members about it. And it was really cool being able to be that person to provide that support. By the end of graduate school, so you may recall that I originally wanted to go to special ops in the Air Force.
I do remember.
I wanted to be a PJ or a combat controller. For those of you who are unfamiliar, when I first was looking at the Air Force, I saw, special operations. I was like, wait, isn't that like Navy SEALs and Green Berets? What the hell is this? But it turns out the Air Force has its share of badasses as well. I ended up getting a contract for CCT, combat control, who are the guys who guide in planes where we don't have the infrastructure to do traditional air traffic control and deconfliction. I got a contract for that, and then a couple weeks later, my recruiter said, well, you're blind as a bat, so you can't do that. And then he was like, but you're really smart, so I can get you a waiver to fly if you become a linguist. But anyway, sorry, tangent. When I decided to enlist, take my master's and run rather than finish up my PsyD and school psychology, I was a sedentary nerd, which may be very hard the nerd part, not so much, but the sedentary part may be a bit hard for you to believe, Brett.
I have never known you to be sedentary.
Although the one last nitpick I have for you, I never ran a marathon in my life. You could not.
Really?
Oh, no.
I remember you running all the time and biking, running, climbing stairs. Like I would not have been surprised. And I thought you had, but anyway.
No. Just 4 miles was about where I topped out because my logic all throughout DLI, I did not have an easy time at DLI. And my logic was, well, if I fail out of here, I'm going to go for special ops again. And, it's blind as a bat, be damned. And I kept training and kept learning until I was one of the ones who passed. And I was like, how the hell did this happen? But, I spent my last year last year and a half, 2 years in graduate school, also prepping to try out for pararescue or combat control, which you got to be in pretty damn good shape for that. And I went from never being particularly athletic to, working out nearly, by the end of my time in the civilian world, probably nearly every day, while, working multiple jobs after I graduated, and before that, doing clinical work or practical work and classwork and the working out and the volunteering at the Crisis Hotline. So I kind of just got used to having, having a lot of stuff on my plate at one time. And given the fact that I have 4 jobs now, I never really got out of that habit.
So was it just to kind of continue what you had started with the suicide hotline and you beginning to serve in those different areas on the side, those volunteer duties?
Well, the teal rope thing, sexual assault thing, sexual assault has always been, and it's become more so in recent years, but as I've become more knowledgeable on trauma and just how brutal it is. But even before, I started to focus my practice and some of my scholarly work on trauma, sexual assault just always held I've always held a special hatred for it. If you think about most of the terrible things that people can do to each other, and this brings me back to conversations we had at the Bible study, right? I remember there was one night we were talking about deception and lying, and you may remember I asked, wait, why are we talking about deception and lying? We could go way higher up and, talk about murder. And that was the night I learned that, from the Christian perspective, all sin is equally bad in God's eyes. But, there are a bunch of terrible things humans can do to each other. But
just clarify that a little bit, that there are different perspectives within even the Christian sphere about that perspective. I wouldn't want to put a kind of blanket statement there, but that is indeed what the conversation was about and the direction that it took that day. Yes.
Sure. Sorry not to mischaracterize the faith, but there are a lot of terrible things humans can do to each other, and frankly, let's not beat around the bush here. And the military is in the business of that, right? We kill people and we break their stuff. Now, we like to think we're doing it for good reasons, but ultimately, we're doing some things that are pretty bad to people. They just happen to be things that hopefully are necessary to achieve security for the people we love back home. But people can do a lot of terrible things to each other. But going back to that point about the military, sometimes killing has a purpose, right? I don't want to put words in your mouth, Brett, but I'm willing to bet that if it came down to your family or a home intruder, that you would be willing to kill to protect that family.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And there are times that deception is absolutely warranted. Going back to the military example and the intelligence example, and even more mundane examples. Torture, I think, is debatable, not because in theory it makes sense. Sometimes you need information from someone to prevent an even bigger atrocity. I say it's debatable because, from what I understand, the data shows that it often doesn't work. It just gets people to tell you anything, whether or not it's correct or incorrect. But that's a sidebar. But sexual assault really doesn't have an instrumental purpose other than you can justify killing in defense of your family. You can't justify sexual assault in defense of your family, right? You can't justify. There is no way that sexual assault is necessary for defense of your country or your community or to prevent a greater atrocity. So it's just kind of this really...
So it stuck out to you as this is something that needs specific attention.
Correct.
And defense against.
Right. And that's why I was drawn to be a teal rope. And that's why when I was at Canon, granted for a very brief time, and frankly, that I was so not, it was so, for lack of a word, dead. We were so underutilized on my shift that I was eventually just not needed. But I did volunteer for a short time as a victim advocate off base at Canon as well, because again, sexual assault, especially nowadays, but even back then, held a very special place in my mind as something that's just really unforgivable, and or I shouldn't say unforgivable, but unjustifiable. And I wanted to be part of the solution for survivors of it.
Okay. And is there anything of that experience that you might think is would be helpful to share, or to anything that you would want to say to someone who might have been in the situation or knows someone in the situation? Is there anything from your experience that you might want to share to that type of person?
Well, not from the the victim advocate military side of the house. I have learned quite a bit about it from my practice on the civilian side, though. If you look at what trauma does, the difference between experiencing a trauma and having PTSD is largely how your brain interprets the event. I've had patients who have been through traumas, like really bad traumas, and their not rationalization, but their understanding of it is, yep, I got really unlucky. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and this happened to me. And those people tend to come out fairly well adjusted from it, because they're not creating a narrative that's distorted or self-blaming or otherwise distorting the facts or putting themselves or others illogically and unfairly in a negative light. What happens is, a lot of times you'll have a victim or a survivor who, if you were to present them the exact details of what happened to them, but in a case study of something that happened to someone else, they would be able to understand, oh, it's absolutely not my fault. It's the attacker's fault, and this survivor did nothing wrong, and, that's that. But a lot of times when it's you, your brain comes up with really distorted ways of looking at the event. And there are reasons for that. One of the more common ones is a sense of control. If it's your fault, that implies that you can prevent it in the future, versus sometimes bad things happen to good people. Anyway, that's a long intro. But what I would say to survivors is that there are a couple of things. First, you're not alone, and you may feel that your case is unique, and particularly if you're dealing with really bad PTSD, you may feel that you are uniquely to blame or responsible or otherwise at fault. I strongly suspect you're not. And I suspect that if you look at how many other survivors of PTSD feel, you'll find that you all kind of have, there are common patterns in how you think about the event that, from an outside perspective, just don't hold up. But it's amazing how these, in cognitive psychology, we call them schema, or in cognitive processing therapy, we call them stuck points. It's really amazing how deeply ingrained these stuck points get. So I guess the first message or takeaway message for a survivor of assault is, you're not alone. This isn't unique to you. And any feelings of self-blame or guilt or shame that you have are likely unwarranted. And if you talk to other survivors and compare the feelings they have and experiences, you'd probably, you may or may not come to see that there's a lot more commonalities, and you're seeing a lot of the same distorted ways of thinking. It's just too hard. You're just too close to it to realize that you're engaging it as well. Does that make sense, Brett?
It does. And perhaps, have you had a chance to personally work with someone who perhaps has gone through this? And if so, what have been some of the kind of emotional maybe blocks that they've had to work through, and how have you been able to help them work through those things?
So unfortunately, most of the trauma cases I've had so this is going back to that blanket statement about Christianity. The blanket statement I'm about to make is very unnuanced, and there are lots of exceptions to it. But in the treatment of trauma, a very popular model right now is three-phase model of trauma treatment. Phase one is kind of education about what trauma is, what separates a trauma from any other bad event like stubbing your toe. And I know that's an absurd comparison, but It's one that, believe it or not, often strikes true with my patients. And also teaching coping skills. Anyone who's ever suffered with PTSD knows that regulating your emotions and being able to calm yourself after being triggered is a huge issue. And the phase one of the three-phase model of trauma treatment is just teaching you ways to cope in your daily life, so that while you're waiting for the phase two treatment to kick in and for the trauma itself to become less, less, not that the trauma itself is any less awful, but for it to become less of this overwhelming thing that's taken over your life, you have the ability to cope in the meantime. The second phase is usually some form of exposure. Now you have prolonged exposure therapy where you're literally exposing yourself to the memory of your trauma until your brain basically goes, okay, it's in the past, it can't hurt me anymore. And that's an oversimplification, but that's essentially what happens. Or you have stuff like cognitive processing therapy where you're looking at those distorted thoughts and looking at how you came to them and really digging into them. Like, is this fair? Is it fair for me to blame myself? And then you have the third phase, which is usually some sort of seeking of justice or meaning making, or some sort of growth, or seeking some sort of growth from the event. I once had a client put it as finding the silver lining in an otherwise really awful event. Now, to your question, Brett, unfortunately, I've worked with plenty of sexual assault survivors on phase one. I haven't yet had the opportunity to work with any of them in phase two. I've worked with plenty of other traumas on phase two, and it comes out, the results are very good. Which, by going back to your messages to survivors of such events, the second one is demoralization is huge in any mental illness. There's a statistical technique, a research technique called factor analysis. And a while back, researchers put one of the leading psychological tests, subjected this test and the responses of many, many people to the process of factor analysis. And what factor analysis does is it takes responses that are endorsed together and clusters them into groups. So you can say, okay, this response, and this response all kind of cluster together. When one is endorsed, the others are endorsed. This is the depression cluster. And then this is the anxiety cluster. This is the anger cluster. The first cluster that they extracted from this very famous test when they subjected it to this analysis was demoralization. Demoralization and lack of hope is kind of where mental illness really takes hold. Not that you weren't dealing with symptoms before, but when you give up on hope and when your morale is just gone, that's when it gets really bad. And so going back to phase one, phase two, and all that, we have a lot of treatments for trauma that work really well. Unfortunately, we have enough experience with trauma now. The VA has published a ton of data on it because 20 years of war will do that. But we have enough experience with trauma now that we have developed several treatments that are really good. And I've had multiple experiences with clients where their symptoms are essentially gone by the end of phase two of treatment. And so the second message to the survivors is don't give up hope. There is hope. You may have had treatment in the past that wasn't effective. We've got better treatments now, or you may have just needed a different clinician, but that hope is out there. But yes, to your question, Brett, and I apologize for the tangent. I have worked with plenty of survivors, but not in that phase two capacity, more in that phase one coping skills and psychoeducation capacity. And for Oh, go ahead.
So I'd love to touch on that, touch both on the coping skills and on the importance of hope. I'd love to hear first on the hope bit. Like, what are some of the what are some of the things that you've learned about being able to, or helping your clients maintain a level of hope in the midst of really dark situation, really dark emotions, recovering or trying to recover from all of that. And then I'd like to circle back to some of the lessons that you've learned about that phase one of things.
Sure. So I, not to go too much on a tangent, but psychology is what the historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, would call a pre-paradigmatic science. What that means is that unlike something like, say, biology, where pretty much everything centers around cell theory, there is a central theory of, or a couple of central theories like cell theory, evolution by natural selection, that everything else pretty much stems from. There are multiple approaches to psychology. And we're beginning to get to kind of a common understanding. David Barlow, a very prominent researcher in anxiety, is a proponent of what he calls the unified protocol. Actually, a good friend of mine was just telling me that he and his therapist have been working through that for some. Oh, that was the other thing. I only deployed once, deployed to Afghanistan in 2020. But working on using this unified protocol, which combines elements of a lot of approaches to psychology to the treatment of many disorders, rather than the old approach of, oh, there's a manual for PTSD, there's a manual for depression, there's a manual for anxiety, so on and so forth. But
kind of takes a complex system approach versus here's the cause, here's the cure.
That's a way to put it, and more rather than seeing. You and I are both martial artists, right? And what I think you and I would find, if you look at most martial arts, even though they have different philosophies and they have different quote unquote techniques, a lot of the underlying principles of what makes the effective ones effective are the same. And the unified protocol looks at what's effective about these different protocols and kind of combines them into a single protocol that can be applied across a wide variety of conditions.
Sort of a Jeet Kune Do of psychology.
Absolutely. Now I am a bit behind the curve on that. I'm still using specific techniques for specific disorders, but the more I learn as I advance in my career, the more I see the wisdom in the unified protocol, because exposure, for example, has always been, or I shouldn't say always, but for a long time has been the tier one treatment or the go-to treatment for anxiety. There's now evidence that exposure can work for depression as well. When you conceptualize depression as a sense of demoralization and the relinquishment of hope, and the idea that happiness is scary because if you have happiness, it can be taken away from you. You have an opportunity for exposure. So we're recognizing the common elements. End tangent. You asked about how I instill hope. If you look at how psychologists are trained, or therapists in general are trained nowadays, a lot of us are trained to take a very non-directive approach. The focus is on active listening and affirmation, validation. And there's a lot of validity there. If you look at how I was trained on the suicide hotline, but I like to think about what I did on the suicide hotline as psychological insulin. I was doing reflection, restatement, validation that would help people get through their day. And if they needed to call us again tomorrow, great, because there was going to be a volunteer then too.
Sort of an empathy shot, so to speak.
Absolutely, your daily shot of empathy. As I've grown in my career, though, and I always liked the cognitive behavioral therapy approach, which is about changing your behaviors and your thoughts to change your emotions. I've really doubled down on the cognitive behavioral, or really the behavioral approaches in general to therapy. And I really like a saying from dialectical behavior therapy, which is kind of a newer version of cognitive behavioral therapy that was developed by Marshall Linehan to deal with the chronically suicidal and often, for lack of a better word, treatment-resistant population. And one of the assumptions of dialectical behavior therapy is the most caring thing you can do for someone is to help them change. So I've become more directive and more educational and taken more of an expert role as I've evolved in my therapy career. Now, I know a lot of my colleagues in the therapy field are probably watching this and are aghast. I specifically remember one of my classmates responding to me in class one time and going, "Excuse me, we don't tell our patients anything." But what I've come to realize is, the whole, "Oh, well, what do you think about that approach?" There's some validity there. It can really help reduce anxiety and help the patient feel heard in the moment. And, sometimes if you go by like humanistic psychology theory, going back to all the different theories of psychology and clinical psychology in particular, sometimes the client just needs a sounding board to figure out what they need. But for something that's serious, like post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, some of the anxiety and related disorders like obsessive compulsive disorder, the client's probably not going to come to the solution on their own. In fact, they've probably tried a whole lot and they're coming to you because they can't figure it out. And what I've realized is that they're not paying a therapist, $100 to $200 an hour to look at them and say, well, what do you think? That you can have an egalitarian relationship. This goes back to why I said, "Hey, Brett, please call me Tom." You can have an egalitarian relationship with an overall low difference in power, but still recognize that, hey, Brett, you're the expert on your life and I'm the expert on the data and psychology. Let's look at how we can combine our knowledge. And that requires me to take more of an expert and directive and educator role. I found that my ability to teach my students, I forget if we mentioned earlier, but I teach counseling master's level students for Pepperdine University. But my ability to teach has also made me a good clinician. And what's made me, if I do say so myself, a good clinician has also made me a good teacher. So going all the way back to your question about how do you instill hope, I do it through education. I can't tell you how many, the first 8 months of my internship, I was on a crisis and psychiatric unit at a psychiatric hospital. I can't tell you how many clients I've had with PTSD who've been like, "Oh yeah, I've already been for trauma treatment and it didn't work," and be like, "Okay, well, what did your therapist tell you about trauma? Did they explain, how it works, what perpetuates it?" And they'd say, "No." And I'd be like, "Okay, let's start with that and go back to the basics, like, hey, what is a trauma? Why is your brain responding in the way that it is? What are the factors that make you more likely to have a post-traumatic stress reaction rather than just say, wrong place, wrong time, that sucks? And what behaviors can you engage in to stop maintaining that post-traumatic stress reaction?" I've had patients who, as soon as I explain the cycle of avoidance that takes place in trauma, have gone, "Okay, so I need to put myself in situations that make me uncomfortable and stop avoiding them." And they have gotten, in the span of a month, Brett, way better. I've had patients thank me for giving them their lives back. And most of the work was done by them. They just needed the education on, hey, what maintains this? So going back to how do I instill hope? I like to think I'm personable, I'm warm, I'm empathetic, I'm caring, and I give that knowledge to my clients, and that knowledge that, hey, there is hope. Here's how your trauma has been maintained. Here's how we're going to interrupt it. Here's what you can do to survive in the meantime, those coping skills, and here's the game plan. And
so you take the approach of knowledge is power and let me empower you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am all about transparency in the therapy relationship. I'm all about partnership and transparency.
Okay. So what are some of the lessons that you've learned of helping people cope through the day-to-day? Because like you said, the process of healing takes a while, and being able to get from, like you said, from stage 1 to stage 2 and start working through actually processing through that painful memory. What are some of the things that you've learned that are really effective for either your students or your clients in being able to manage those difficult emotions, those difficult times where they feel at their darkest? They're working their way forward, but they just need something to get through to the next day. What are some of the things that you found very effective?
Well, the game changer for me was understanding the role of the body in emotions. In cognitive behavioral therapy, which as said is my bread and butter, we talk about the connection between thought, behavior, and emotion. There's actually a fourth node, and that's your body. And we alluded to this when I was in my master's program. We talked about diaphragmatic breathing and progressive muscle relaxation, which are two coping techniques that are very effective, but I never really understood why they were effective. I just thought it's like, okay, you're forcing yourself to chill out when you're anxious. But it turns out the relationship, and it's funny because, this is like what I'm about to tell you is basic psychology, but sometimes going back to that knowledge is power piece, it just takes drawing the right connections to understand how things work. And by the way, if any of your listeners want more information on this, quick plug for The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. I read a lot of books when I was taking my trauma class at Spalding University. And my supervisor at the time specializes in trauma. She was trained in her internship at the VA, learned multiple of those peer-reviewed, empirically scored treatments for trauma. And she took that same class at Spalding University. And we are in agreement that of all the books we read, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, it was the most useful book we read that year. And it is very accessible. It's a good balance between science and imparting that knowledge and being a good read and being accessible and approachable for the average reader. But
it's one of the most recommended books that I've heard among psychologists and therapists, that this is something that everyone needs to read.
Absolutely. The runner-up to that book, at least if you're interested in trauma, for non-therapists. For therapists, I would start with the Manual for Cognitive Processing Therapy or the Manual for Prolonged Exposure Therapy. But for non-therapists, and for therapists too, there is a book on trauma by Judith Herman. I forget she's another big name in trauma, but I forget the title offhand. I can get it for you, but that taught me a lot about trauma as well. But I'm gonna go back and kind of walk you through what I walk a lot of my clients through. So
I see a couple books. I just looked that up real quick. Judith Herman. I see Truth and Repair, and I see Trauma and Recovery.
I believe it is Trauma and Recovery. I can get with you afterwards and look in my Kindle just to confirm, but I believe it's Trauma and Recovery.
Okay.
But a couple of quick questions for you, Brett, and these are the same questions that I walk through with a lot of my patients. What is the purpose of emotion?
Are you asking me?
Yep.
Well, my understanding of it thus far is emotion is the way that your subconscious communicates its conclusions. So your subconscious, as I understand it, being a layperson, my own study, my own experience, it's like the tip of the iceberg versus the bottom of the iceberg. The subconscious is the body of the iceberg, and it's actually doing most of your life processing of your experience. The tip of the iceberg is your actual conscious mind that you are aware of, the thoughts that you are aware of. But there's so much going on in your life that is being processed in your subconscious that you're not aware of. And it's usually taking your past experience and it's filtering your present experience through the lens of your past experience in order to see what's safe, what's not safe, all those things. So as I understand it, your emotions are how your subconscious communicates its conclusions, usually through your body to your mind.
Absolutely. Wow, I don't know if I've ever heard a better answer than that. Honestly. And I appreciate you bringing up safety, because in addition to the emotional system being how your brain comes to a very quick, broad conclusion about a situation, we have to acknowledge that emotions have survival value. I will say that again, emotions have survival value. When I was walking to the chow hall in Afghanistan, and I heard the incoming alarm go off, which means that we had an artillery shell coming towards the base. Did I feel fear? I absolutely did. And that gave me the energy to drop what I was doing and haul ass to my truck so that we could all, or in turn, haul ass to our fighting position and get ready to fight. I'm guessing at some point, Brett, in your life, you've been in a fight.
It depends on your definition, but yes, I've been in different fights.
I'm guessing you felt anger at some point.
Yes. To clarify, most of my fights were in like a ring. So okay. I was in a bit of a controlled setting, but I have been in just like more like altercations. So I have definitely felt those emotions, but I have not had the opportunity or whatever you want to call it to get in an actual fist fight yet. Sure.
But I'm guessing you felt a little bit of anger when you got struck in that match in the ring.
Mm-hmm.
That prepares you. One, the anger activates biochemical processes that dull pain and give you the endurance to neutralize the threat. But it increases your motivation to deal with the threat. Sadness lets you know that you've lost something and brings your attention to a problem. And in theory, when you're not talking about depression, which becomes this self-perpetuating cycle that just kind of brings you down, but normative sadness and grief acknowledge that you've lost something and motivate the unpleasant feeling motivates you to try to avoid that loss in the future and try to learn from that loss and take steps to prevent loss in the future. So, and there are other emotions that we can talk about. Brett, you're married. I assume you and your wife had a first date at some point.
Yep.
I'm guessing you felt some joy on that first date that was like, hey, I like this person. I want to spend more time with her.
Absolutely.
So emotions have a survival value in a positive way as well. But the other thing about emotions is they're relatively quick. Because I'm sure there have been times where you've been in a situation and you're like racking your brain thinking that, and you're like, I really don't know what I think about this situation yet. Well, in survival situations, you don't have that luxury. If you've got a rocket coming in Afghanistan, you don't have the time to be like, I wonder what the angle of the attack of the rocket is. And maybe if I just stand a couple feet to the left, I'll be okay. What you need is, holy crap, get to the nearest hardened shelter now. You need a quick reaction. And that's what emotions do. They are faster and more efficient, if less refined than our cognitive processes. So that's the first kind of question I ask my clients when I'm educating them about trauma. The next question I'm going to ask you, Brett, is have you ever put your hand on a hot stove?
Absolutely.
How quickly did you pull that hand away?
Quicker than I had time to think.
You probably didn't even realize you had touched something hot by the time you pulled your hand away. Is that fair to say?
Yep.
I know I was at the range a couple weeks ago and I accidentally touched the muzzle of my rifle after I had fired a bunch of rounds through it. And that hand came away before I even realized, wow, that was hot. Our bodies can react to threats before our brain has fully appraised that threat. This was demonstrated.
That's the underlying premise behind training in martial arts.
Absolutely. That idea of muscle memory. And emotions can, and your brain, there was a great study by one of my undergrad professors. I think he was the second author on it, I believe if you Google the rickety bridge study, it'll come up. What they did was they took an attractive female Confederate, and I know the term Confederate has a colloquial meaning, but in research it just means someone who's assisting in research that the subject does not know is assisting in the research. They took an attractive female Confederate and put her on two bridges. One was kind of a steady looking cement bridge, and one was a perfectly safe but a little less stable looking like rope and wooden bridge, if I remember correctly. And they had men coming across this bridge, and she offered to let them take part in a survey. And at the end of the survey, if I remember their methodology correctly, and this is probably about 15, 20 years since I've read this, no, 15, let's go with. She said, hey, if you want the results of the survey, here's my number, give me a call. The men who met her on which bridge, which group do you think called her more?
I would guess the cement bridge, because they were more focused on her and less focused on survival.
You would think, but it was actually the rickety bridge. And the conclusion the authors came to, if you think about going back to that first date, Brett, I'm guessing at some point, talking to your now wife, your heart may have accelerated its heart rate a little bit. Your respiratory rate may have increased a little bit out of excitement. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
What same physiological responses do you have when you are in a less safe situation and you think you might be in danger?
Anxious. You get the same physiological response, different emotional attachment.
Right. Your body basically has two states, calm and aroused. And I've learned the hard way not to use the term aroused around a bunch of teenagers when running a group with them. But calm or aroused, calm or excited, whatever you want to call it. Going back to the CBT model and why body plays a role, your body can react independently of your brain to keep you safe, going back to that muscle memory. And your brain then plays catch up. It interprets your body's reaction to a situation and then takes in all the data and makes a determination about what you're thinking, what you're feeling. So you have these guys with in a mild state of arousal from walking across this rickety bridge, and all of a sudden they meet this attractive lady who's giving them her phone number. We're more likely to call her, at least according to theory, because their brains are going, heart rate, respiratory rate, maybe I'm sweating a little bit. Hot girl, I'm in love. So going back to what I recommend, and I apologize for all the tangents, but I think also in a weird way, this is what makes me effective at getting to my clients. It takes me a while to get to my point, but I also don't condescend to tell them this is all you need to know. I explain my logic, and I do so in a way that I find my clients respond really well to. So we know that your body plays a role in your emotional experience and has a role in the fight or flight response for the sake of your survival. And we know that your brain, in making its appraisal of your emotional state, looks at both the situation and your bodily response. Now, going back to using you as an example, Brett, I want you to think of a time in your life where you have been extremely anxious or extremely angry. How easy is it to think rationally when you're in that state?
It's nearly impossible.
Nearly impossible. Now, going back to the traditional model of cognitive behavioral therapy, we say you can change your behavior or change your thoughts to change your emotions. But we've just established that when your emotions are really high, you're not really capable of thinking rationally. So if you're about to swing and punch me in the face, and I say, hey, Brett, let's think about the consequences of this action and whether or not this is really rational, you're probably not thinking about that right now, and probably not even capable of thinking about, because the parts of your brain that are dedicated to higher thinking have given way towards the emotion centers of your brain that are trying to keep you alive. So one of the things we therapists love to do to help our clients regulate their emotions is not effective when your emotions are at an 8 out of 10, a 9 out of 10, a 10 out of 10. So we need something simple that doesn't require higher levels of thought, and that can be done with minimal skill when someone is in a cognitively compromised state because they're triggered and they're distressed, or they're feeling high levels of shame, or they're feeling high levels of anxiety. And that's where the body-based interventions come into play, because we've established that your bodily state plays a role in your brain determining your emotional state. So if you can calm down your body, your brain will see that your body is calming down and go, hey, heart's slowing back down, lungs are slowing back down, I guess I can calm down. So there are a couple of skills, and I forget if I already said this, but for anyone listening, I am just an intern. I don't yet have my doctorate. I am not licensed, so nothing I am saying right now constitutes medical advice and is for entertainment purposes only. But in dialectical behavior therapy, we have what are called tip skills. And my fellow interns would either laugh or smack their heads against the desk if they heard me say this, because I talk about tip skills all the time. To me, if you have to do one thing in therapy and you have no plan, you go for tip skills. But tip skills are temperature, intense exercise, pace breathing, and paired muscle relaxation. And what these are skills that, for various reasons, have a track record of calming down our bodies quickly. And so if you engage, the first one, temperature, is just dunking your face in water a couple times to take advantage of the mammalian dive reflex. And if you do that for a couple minutes, just dunk your face in cold water, take it out, dunk your face in cold water, take it out, that will help your body really quickly regulate its fight or flight response and bring that emotion down much quicker than trying to talk it out or rationally process it. Intense exercise, as a fellow athlete and martial artist, Brett, I'm willing to bet you've experienced this before, where if something's bothering you, you go in and you do a hard training session, it probably ain't bothering you anymore by the time you're done. And pace breathing and progressive muscle relaxation work on that elevated heart rate, that elevated respiratory rate, and that muscle tension that you tend to get when you're in a stressful situation, and try to bring them down in an attempt to trick your brain into bringing down that level of arousal. So those, in addition to the to kind of just the discussion of why they work, and that education about the role of the body in the anxiety and the fight or flight and the stress response, and in addition to some education about how trauma works, those skills are really, we just covered half of what I cover in my first 4 or 5 sessions with my patients who are there for trauma. And those are the skills that if I needed to help a client calm down quickly, those are what I'm going for. In fact, if I might summarize a little bit of what you're saying, and you can tell me where I'm right, where I'm wrong, all of that. Someone goes through something traumatic and their brain wires it a certain way. They process it a certain way. Neurons connect, all of that. And so they are, from that point forward, until they go through the healing process, that part of their brain is wired and connected, and it's neurological. It's part of their body. It's wiring that's happening, and that part of they're experiencing that all the time because of what they've gone through. What you're talking about is basically doing physical things in order to calm the nervous system and hopefully rewire that so that you can then work through the actual event, not experiencing the same type of emotions as you were before. Almost perfect. The only nitpick I'll say is that the tip skills or the coping skills don't rewire anything, but they bring you down to a level where you can now have that rational conversation or engage in the exposure that will rewire things. Because what the therapies that I am a big fan of, cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure therapy, and there are others that have an evidence base, but those are the two that I've that are my go-to. What they do, cognitive processing therapy, going back to those cognitive distortions that you get in people with PTSD, it very gently challenges, like, hey, is it fair? Is it really reasonable to feel guilty about this? Could you really have known what was going to happen? How do you know that if you had made a different choice, that the situation would have turned out any differently? And gently challenging those distorted thoughts that maintain the shame, the anxiety, the negative thoughts about the self or about the world. And what prolonged exposure therapy does, going back to that point that trauma is, or PTSD is when traumatic memory becomes this overwhelming thing that's very much affecting you in the present. I think I alluded to earlier, a big factor in the cycle that maintains PTSD is avoidance. I've had multiple patients say, I can't face that memory. I'll relapse on substance use, or, I can't handle it. I'll go crazy. I won't be able to recover. And what we gradually do is work them up to facing that memory and facing it for long enough, most importantly, to allow a full fight or flight response to happen and then subside when your body goes, I've been thinking about this terrible thing that happened to me for the past 40 minutes and I'm not dead yet. I guess this memory isn't going to hurt me. And that's when the rewiring happens, because, well, actually, technically, the research that I'm aware of says that you technically don't remove old connections that you've made, but you create new competing connections. So whereas that old connection said traumatic memory equals dangerous, you're now creating a new connection that says traumatic memory is unpleasant but safe and not going to hurt me. Does that make sense, Brett?
Thank you for explaining that. I'd like to perhaps transition to a little bit different area of you personally as a practitioner, especially as someone who's an intern. You got multiple jobs, finishing like so many different things that you're working on. How do you maintain your mental health as you go through mental health, physical health, all the different brands of health, different versions of it or aspects of it? How do you maintain your own health as you keep such a busy schedule and are spending your life helping other people?
Well, that's been an area of journey for me as well. You've spoken very highly of my discipline. When I was in graduate school, or early on in graduate school before COVID, I was working out about 10 hours a week. And I had a very kind of pivotal moment where a colleague of mine invited me over to her house to have dinner with her husband, herself and her husband. And I remember thinking I had a plan to be at the gym that night. And for my first hour or two hanging out with them, I was like, okay, if I digest for this much time, I can still go to the gym. And finally, after like 3 or 4 hours of hanging out with them, I was like, screw it, I guess I'm not going to the gym tonight. And, if you remember how disciplined I was at DLI, that would not have been an issue. In fact, you may recall that I won't say this person's name, but you probably know who I'm talking about. A certain friend of ours was dismissed while we were at Goodfellow, and when I was planning on going to the dojo the night of his going away party, and then coming to the party late just so I don't miss that class, so that I checked the box for that day. And it was another friend of ours who came over and said, dude, this guy's, one of your closest friends in the military. You can take a day off for one night. It's not going to kill you. So that's kind of how rigid I was in my approach to fitness. Now, fitness is still very important to me, but what I've learned is, I no longer have any illusions that I'm going to be a special operator. And that's not me saying that I can't do it. It's me acknowledging that I have made and this was a moment I had in Afghanistan where an NCO I was deployed with was like, dude, you should really consider trying to go special ops. And I was like, dude, I'm 2 years into my doctorate. I've got all this stuff going on. It's not that I can't. I'm making that choice that I'm probably not going to do it. And what I realized is that as much as that I still want to maintain fitness to fight. I still want to be in shape to defend my family, to defend my country, and to be able to haul ass to cover if need be on my next deployment. But I became a bit more flexible. And so if I only get to the gym or the dojo a handful of times in a week now, so be it. So I still maintain high standards for myself, not quite as high as I used to, just because, again, the special ops thing is off the table. But I've become more flexible and less rigid in the implementation or in the attempt to get to those goals. Additionally, in working out, right, you have this idea of active rest. So if you have reached muscle failure with push-ups, you can still run. As said, I have 4 jobs, and I historically have used those 4 jobs as active rest for each other. Teaching is one of my favorite things about being in the field of psychology. I love teaching my students. And so I have literally gone into class with chills from, having the flu or COVID or whatever, and thinking, I should probably cancel class tonight, and come out of class energized, because that's how much I enjoy teaching my students. And so even though teaching is a job, it actually is in a way restful for me, and a form of recuperation in a way. So
you would say choosing to do things that invigorate you even as you go about your busy schedule.
Right. And so really just pursuing valued directions, which is, if you look at the third wave of behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, that is a huge concept. And honestly, I think that's one of the reasons that that depression is so prevalent in our society today, is that so many people are not pursuing be it their fault or society's fault. That's a much larger conversation we could have. But so many people are not pursuing valued directions or directions in their lives that they consider valuable and worthwhile. But pursuing valued directions, doing things that bring you both fulfillment and pleasure, and then having flexibility and giving yourself grace and self-compassion, and realizing that, your self-esteem, it should not be entirely tied up on how fast you can run a mile and a half, or how many push-ups you can do. That can be an element of your identity and your self-esteem, but hinging your sense of self-worth on any one thing, or even a small handful of things, sets you up for disaster. And recognizing your worth as a human being, and the virtue of the value of the journey, even if you have fallen short of your standard this time, or even if you've encountered failure, that just means going to, I think, Theodore Roosevelt's "Man in the Arena" quote, that just means you have the courage to try. And having that self-compassion, for me, is a huge self-compassion that I lacked back in the days of DLI, is key to doing as much as I'm doing and maintaining my sanity, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you for elucidating that. What would you say, just really quickly as we're kind of coming to the end of our time here, what would you say are 3 things, if someone is getting started on their own journey in pursuing a healing career, what would you say are like 3 things to do in the next week or so to kind of start gaining some progress and understanding where they might want to go, what they should do in that direction, and a way of moving forward in a sustainable way?
The first thing I would say is do your research. There are a lot of healing professions out there, from medicine to being a therapist or psychologist to allied health professions. And within the therapy realm, there are about not quite a dozen, but there are a bunch of different ways to get there, and they're all a little different. When I first decided I wanted to be a healing professional, my parents said, be a psychiatrist. They're like psychologists, but they're better. And we can debate about whether that was true back in the day, but nowadays, psychiatry, and I hope I'm not offending anybody by saying this, it's largely become a very specialized profession that's very medically focused. So I have a lot of colleagues in psychiatry, the great people, and I love having them on my team. But to quote a good friend of mine, when he said, "I am the pill guy," that is what he does. He prescribes pills. He doesn't do psychotherapy. So anyway, all this,
as I understand it, they are a lot more focused on biochemistry and maintaining proper levels. And it's much more a physiological thing that they're addressing versus the more cognitive, the more psychological thing that you're addressing.
correct. And that's why I say you got to do your research, because you got to know, how you want to be a healer. And no one route is necessarily better than another. It's just, how do you want to affect people? If you look at the effect sizes for treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, if according to a handout from the VA, there's no comparison between medicine and behavioral therapy. Behavioral therapy blows medical interventions out of the water. Flip the script though and look at bipolar or schizophrenia, and I'm going, have fun, medical doctors. That is your territory. So it really depends what population you want to work with, and how you want to impact that population. So do your research, figure out what sort of helping professional you want to be, because there's many ways to do it. Point two is make sure that it's almost like when you fly on an airplane and they say, hey, if the oxygen masks drop, make sure you put your own mask on first. Make sure you put your own mask on first. I'm not saying you have to be completely free of trauma or completely free of insecurity or shame or doubt. Nobody is. Otherwise, if you wanted a therapist who had no issues at all, you would get a robot, which we may be moving to. But you want to be in a place where you have your demons on a leash and you have them under control. And I think that sometimes we focus so much on the validation and the affirmation piece in therapy that we minimize the importance of behavior change and learning skills and mastering these, and gaining mastery and ownership of our recovery. And I would say that if you're going to be in a helping profession, you need to at least have it under enough control that you are regulated and that you can model some of the things you're asking your patient to do. Because I have met therapists.
Practice what you preach.
Exactly. You don't necessarily need to be perfect, but you need to be a step or two ahead of where the patient is in order to be a good model for them. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you so much for doing that. So research all the different fields, see what interests you before you start pursuing a certain direction. And before you start taking those steps, that way you can have an understanding of what all is out there and figure out. I especially liked the idea of choose the population that you want to affect, because that will not determine, but that will certainly affect the route that you take to get there.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the resources that you find helpful, or that your clients or that your students have found helpful for someone who wants to learn more about this type of thing, or someone who wants to get your type of help? Where are some resources, YouTube resources, books, online resources? What are some things that come to mind that would help someone on their pursuit, either to pursue their own healing or to become a better healer themselves?
That is an excellent question, and it's a very relevant question because there's a lot of misinformation out there. Well, oftentimes very well-intentioned misinformation, but misinformation all the same. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret of the therapy world, the psychology and therapy world. There are a lot of practitioners out there who are well-intentioned but don't necessarily know what they're doing, at least not for every disorder. So finding help can actually be really tricky. For anything involving trauma, I refer my clients to the VA website. If you just Google VA PTSD, a ton of resources will come up, and I can provide some of the most helpful ones to you to post along with this interview. But the VA, even for civilian patients, the VA is a treasure trove of information on trauma. They even have a ton of apps, everything from a companion app that helps you as you're going through cognitive processing therapy or prolonged exposure therapy, to a safety planning app where if you are suicidal or you have a loved one who's suicidal, this app will actually walk you through the creation of a Stanley Brown safety plan, which is one of the evidence-based interventions we use for helping people avoid self-harm or suicidal behavior. Basically giving them a toolkit and an escalating set of tools they can use when they are in distress and when they are not capable of keeping themselves safe without guidance. So the VA we have learned a lot about trauma in the past 2 decades of war, and the VA has done a great job of making that knowledge available to the public. And as I've already said, knowledge is power. For seeking information about treatments for any mental health disorder, what approach is the right approach? I recommend the Division 12 website and the Division 53 website. Division 12 website is the Division of Clinical Psychology of the American Psychological Association. And what they do is they review the evidence for every major treatment for most mental disorders. And they post, hey, is this treatment strongly evidence-based? Is it modestly evidence-based? Or there are even some where it says this is contraindicated because research has shown it actually makes things worse. So if you're looking at a therapist and you want to know, hey, does their approach make sense for what I've been diagnosed with and what I'm dealing with? The Division 12 website for adults is great. The Division 53 website is, I don't work with kids as much, so I forget what the division is called, but it's essentially the Division of Child Clinical Psychology. And it, similarly to Division 12's website, it lists, okay, you're dealing with impulsivity and aggression. Here's the types of interventions you're going to want. You're dealing with depression. Okay, here's the interventions that have shown evidence for being effective for kids of these ages. So if going back to the point that there's a lot of misinformation out there, and unfortunately, as psychology has become less, I don't know if you knew this, Brett, but the field of psychology was originally a science, not quite a hard science, but the first psychologists were scholars. They were trying to figure out how the brain works. It was only later on that the field of psychology started applying that knowledge to the alleviation of suffering. But as the field has grown bigger and the need for mental health practitioners has risen, I think that the standard of clinicians being scientists has gradually been weakened. And as a result, it's made the field, and if you look at the author Scott Lilienfeld, he rails against this. It's made the field a hunting ground for pseudoscience. You have plenty of pseudoscience making its way among them, infiltrating the field where it can look just like a good intervention where there's really no evidence base for it. So if you want to know if what your child is being treated with or what you're going to be treated with is evidence-based, Division 12's website, Division 53's website are great resources. There's Psychology Today, which is a resource for finding a therapist. It basically, any therapist can ask, I forget if you have to pay or not, but any therapist can be listed on that website. And you can search in an area and you can search by specialties, things like that. And go ahead.
Just a quick note, we're running short on time.
Okay. You can look up.
I'll cut that.
No worries. You can look up a clinician in your area. But here's the final piece of advice I would give along the lines of finding a therapist. A very wise supervisor of mine once said that if you don't see any change within 6 sessions, go elsewhere. Different theories say different things about this. But what I would argue, and this goes back to my own change of heart when it comes to, the more non-directive therapies. Not that there's anything wrong with the humanistic approaches and unconditional positive regard and, active listening and all that. But when you're dealing with severe PTSD, severe OCD, severe social anxiety, your life is being very severely affected. And having to wait many months or many years to see a significant difference in your symptoms, you can't afford to wait that long. So when you're on that healing journey and you're looking for someone to help you with it, make sure that you're seeing a meaningful difference pretty early. Otherwise, I would recommend consider looking elsewhere.
Those are some really valuable resources. Psychology Today was definitely really key in my own healing. I found my own therapist there, and several of those other resources, some of which I haven't heard of, but I will definitely look into. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for elucidating all of those different resources for people who are on their own journey, and just thank you for being you and for being out there trying to change the world in your field.
Thank you, Brett. I think you give me way too much credit, but I appreciate you having me on.